Welcome back, Mighty Vandals, to Tubs of the Club, brought to you by Snake River Stampede Whiskey, but we'll tell you a little bit more about that later. We are the Idaho Vandals affiliate on the Big Sky Podcast Network. I am your host, Dallas Hammer, joined today by brave, bold, Brian Marceau.
Dude, good to be here. Can't believe football season's finally coming, man. 2 weeks.
And last but not least, he's not always producing, but he is always seducing, Martin Heemstra, our man in Moscow. Martin, how's it going?
It is hot as hell in Moscow right now. It's like a balmy 92 degrees right now. Band camp just started, so I'm hearing the band right now outside my apartment, which is fun to always hear, which means school's almost around the corner, which means Vandal football's almost here as well.
I am expecting plenty of band stories to be coming out over the next couple weeks. Looking forward to that. Breaking news, guys, before we get into today's show. Today is our Big Sky Conference preview, but breaking news right off the top. Head coach Jason Eck has lost his keys in the Arboretum. So if you are in Moscow, please get down to the Arboretum, help a guy out, find those keys, message him on Twitter if you've got them. Let's help a guy out. Anyways, as I buried the lead, today is our Big Sky Conference preview show. We're going to talk about all 12 teams in the conference. So we're just going to jump right in because we got a lot to get through and not a whole lot of time to do it. So I'm just going to do the draft right off the front. We're going to snake draft this. Brian and I will just alternate picks until we get to the last team standing. Coming in at the worst team in the Big Sky, number 12, Idaho State. Brian, what do you think about Idaho State?
I think everyone knows the story of Idaho State because it's the exact same story from last season with Charlie Ragle, except now with Cody Hawkins as head coach. It's a factory reset from an awful year. There's going to be a ton of new faces. There's no all returning Big Sky talent at Idaho State. So as far as like accomplished players, there's a handful, guys like Malachi Rango, but running back. But honestly, I think the player story that everyone's going to focus that's easiest right now is quarterback. Cody Hawkins has 6 quarterbacks on the roster. It's expected that Hunter Hayes is probably going to start early, but look for Jordan Cook. He's a transfer from Diablo Valley Community College in California. In scrimmages, he looks like the more talented guy, but he's younger. I wouldn't be shocked if we see Hunter Hayes take the OOC knocks and then Jordan Cook takes over come season. But I think the only real story that people care about or should care about right now with Idaho State is their dome was renovated, Dallas.
At least you've kind of got those hoarder corners, Brian. I know how much you love those. But really, guys, that's the story of Idaho State. Yet another person coming in to try to save that team. Hunter Hayes is there from previous years at quarterback. He's probably, if he's the guy, he's probably not going to be the guy for very long. They do have Raiden Hunter, but he's the only returning offensive player who had over 250 yards last year. There's really not a lot to talk about this team. Even when you look at their schedule, they've got 3 conference games that they have a snowball's chance in hell at winning. Northern Colorado, Eastern Washington, and at Portland State. And then realistically, they should get smashed in every other game. Going to be a really terrible year in Idaho State land. And sorry, don't really care about it. Let's move on. Nothing else to cover about them.
One thing, thank you for correcting me on Raiden Hunter, not Malachi Rango. We've been doing this too long. But hey, we do have to update quick on the updated Holt Arena. 3 of the hoarder corners still exist. One of them is being converted into a meeting room for the team. So good news for Idaho State, bad news for everyone else in the world. Second, there's some natural light coming into Holt Arena on one of the sideline sides. I don't know which one, and I'm not going to research it, but in short, it should look like a little bit nicer. They have new turf too, so like it will look like actual turf. The end.
Brian, you got the next pick. Who is the number 11 team in the Big Sky Conference?
Man. This is. I gotta go with. I'm sorry. I gotta go top 5 Portland State. Absolutely, this might feel a little bit early for you guys, and was earlier than when we did last year. Our way too early preview, but look, Portland State goes 4-7 last season with a ton of upperclassmen. They have Dante Sachere, quarterback, coming back. He's kind of a dual threat, not that great a passer, but like, okay, he is a strong runner. But they lost half the starters on a team that was senior laden last year and sucked. We hear every single year about how Portland State has this great recruiting class because they get transfers from other some FBS programs, and they get to recruit some guys in Portland who went to camps. But with the way the team underachieved last season with their leadership there, the fact that Bruce Barnum was trying to jump ship and go to Idaho State in the offseason, I think Portland State face planting is completely on the table in a way that it hasn't been previously.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Bruce Barnum was talking about and ended up as one of the 2 finalists for the Idaho State job tells you everything that you need to know about where this team is. There is no real chance that this team's going to turn it around. They do return half of the starters from last year's squad. They do have a fair amount of defensive talent. They have a couple transfers coming in. Receiver Jermaine Braddock from San Jose State. He's got, I think, about 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns in his career. They have Dallas Holiday, an offensive lineman that transferred down from Boise Junior College, ended up playing in 34 games up there. So they have talent coming in. They always have these great recruiting classes. But, I mean, really, this is the same story we've been seeing since Bruce Barnum's been there. They had that first great year where he made the playoffs, and then every year since, they just haven't done anything other than be mediocre. And that's realistically what we're looking at. They've got a handful of winnable games. They do have a fairly easy schedule this year. They've got Cal Poly, NAU, ISU, Eastern, and Northern Colorado. So, I mean, there's a chance they go 5-0 in those games, lose their other 3 games, which are Montana State, Montana, UC Davis. They're not going to win those games. There is a chance they could go 5-3 in conference, but that would require a whole lot different than what we've seen out of Bruce Barnum over the last decade.
No, like
any
honestly,
closing thoughts, Brian, on Portland State?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the most interesting thing, if you look at the Portland State schedule, and thanks for walking through the Big Sky part, they avoid Sac State and Weber State, which is obviously beneficial for them. But their third OOC game, Portland State always plays at least one sub D1 team. But who in God's name are the North American Stallions? I have absolutely no idea what conference that is. I have absolutely no idea what level of competition that is. I know nothing other than they're North American. This sounds like the Bible school version of football. There is not a single team in this conference I'm more over than Portland State. I'm infinitely more intrigued to pay attention to Idaho State with the upcoming season than Portland State, Dallas. Oh man, like I said, we've done too many of these previews for some facets of talking about the Big Sky. Portland State, I'm done. Martin is North Americans in the SAC conference. That's exactly what they're hoping to hear.
Then they're in the NAIA. They're not even in an NCAA school. So being a Bible school as the basketball teams play, very similar comparison. I'm done with Portland State. I honestly wish they would get kicked out of this conference. I'm done with them. So let's move on. Team number 10. I want to take NAU as team number 10 in the Big Sky. They went 3-8 last year. The only reason they went 3-8 is because they had one of the best quarterbacks in the Big Sky in RJ Martinez. Well, he's gone now. He transferred to Baylor. So we're now looking at whatever year of the Chris Ball era this is. They have a decent amount of guys that have returned on the defense. They have a fair amount of guys that have returned on the offense. But it comes down to their quarterback is now going to be either transfer quarterback Daniel Britt from Montana or Kai Milner, who was at Cal last year. Even former quarterback Jeff Widener, who was the guy that it looked like was going to be their guy in the spring season. He's now a defensive back. So NAU, I don't know what they're doing. I think the most interesting thing to me about NAU is that somehow they received votes in the top 25 coaches poll, Brian.
I saw that too. And I don't know if Chris Ball is a voter. I also don't know if there's some coaches who take this as a joke because Northern Arizona, look, they're kind of like Portland State to me, except I don't hate Northern Arizona the way I really don't. I can't stand top 5 Portland State. I would love Northern Arizona to be competitive, but you're right. Chris Ball's been there long enough that, hey, this is his roster. The culture of that team, the DNA of that team, that is all on Chris Ball. And they certainly haven't really been trending up at all over the last few seasons. Look, if Daniel Britt is in the discussion for quarterback at Northern Arizona, then they're going to have to be a run first team because that was what the feature of Daniel Britt when he was at University of Montana. So I don't expect that dude's going to get a start. There's some talent at the wide receiver, Hendricks Johnson, who, because of the COVID year, Hendricks Johnson feels like he's been there for a decade. but he's one of the better receivers in the league. But NAU was kind of middling defensively last year, which was a representative step up. I don't know what you'd say in the Chris Ball era would tell you this is the year NAU makes a big step defensively. And I'm with you. I think NAU is, I probably wouldn't pick them quite this low. But I'm fine picking them this low because I think the other teams have at least a reason to think they're trending up. I think stasis is the ceiling at NAU, and I'm ready to move on.
Yeah, the one thing I will say is that NAU has not a great schedule. The only winnable games I see on the schedule for them is Portland State, Northern Colorado, and Eastern. Outside of that, they're going to run into UC Davis, Montana State, Weber State, Sac State, and Montana. They don't have a chance in any of those games. This is just another team that's mediocre at the absolute best. They do have the first all Big Sky player of the teams we've selected so far. They have Eloy Kweti, defensive lineman. His brother Cosmas played there over the last few years. I think there's a third brother. Some decent talent on the defensive side of the ball, but not enough to do anything, especially when Ball's a defensive coach and last year is their first time being anything other than pretty putrid. There's nothing here, Brian. Let's move on.
Okay, and so that leaves me drafting. So we have Idaho State, Portland State, and NAU. Now, man, I'm gonna go Cal Poly. I really don't want to go Cal Poly this low because I do think there's reason to be interested in Cal Poly. Look, they're now coached by Paul Wolf, who he took over from Bill Baldwin, left to be the offensive coordinator at Arizona State. Last season, Cal Poly was the number one passing team in the Big Sky with Spencer Brash as their quarterback. Brash is only going to be playing at Cal Poly if they've had a catastrophe in the offseason with their quarterback options. I expect the Heward, who transferred from the University of Washington, you'd expect that dude to be penciled in as a starter at Cal Poly at this point, former blue chip. But look, the big story for Cal Poly is they absolutely can and will score points this season. The question is, was there cataclysmically awful defensive performing for the entire year last season? What can Paul Wolf do to change that? And was any of that related to just having injury and absolutely no depth whatsoever? It doesn't matter if you're talking secondary or if you're talking up front, but Cal Poly, man, I could run against Cal Poly and I have a bum knee. So that is probably what matters the most for Cal Poly is, can they go from being just cataclysmically awful at defense to just like being a bad D3 team defensively? Because they're going to score some points. I don't think the offense will change that much under Paul Wolf. I do think there's a little bit more potential here because timely interceptions more or less took 2 or 3 wins from Cal Poly last season. But I also don't think there's yet. You have to be really looking at Cal Poly glass half full from last season to view much of a big step up. But I do think there's enough talent that this is not Idaho State. I think there's enough interest that I view them. Cal Poly is trending much more upward than Portland State or NAU.
I completely agree, Brian. This is that edge where we get off the basement of the conference to teams that maybe could put something together. This was the year we kind of had circled as if Bo Baldwin is going to succeed at Cal Poly, this is the year he's going to do it. Obviously, he's gone. Paul Wolf is there now, which kept most of the coaching staff intact. I don't see this team being super great. Their schedule is also not super favorable. Their winnable games are probably realistically PSU, NOCO, and Eastern. So they're just kind of hoping to pick off a couple of those teams in the bottom of the conference. But they are a very, very, very young team. There's only 1 senior in the defensive 2 deep, only 6 in the offensive 2 deep. So this feels like just one more building block until maybe next year is the year, especially with a little bit of turnover from Baldwin to Wolf and changing the offensive system slightly. The quarterback is going to be the most interesting thing here. Again, obviously, Sam Heward, the big name, one of the biggest recruits to ever come down to the Big Sky. But Spencer Brash played okay most of last year. Jaden Jones actually looked pretty good before he got hurt. I think the depth chart right now is Spencer Brash 1, Sam Heward 2, random Joe Schmo number 3. So apologies to if the Cal Poly parent of whatever kid that is watching this. And then Jalen Jones is the 4th quarterback, probably because of that injury. So to me, it looks like it's Spencer Brash with your ceiling's probably not great. If Sam Heward comes in and plays like he was expected to at Washington as a 5-star recruit from an NFL family, maybe this is the year that Cal Poly starts to take that step into maybe the middle of the conference before maybe they can climb back to being respectable. But again, this is all projection at this point. They went 2-9 last year. They've got a tough schedule this year. They lost their head coach. The numbers are against them in this, Brian.
No, Jaden Jones, look, he was actually good last season. Spencer Brash only took over because Jaden Jones blew out his knee. He was freshman. He was a legitimate dual threat quarterback. But with a dual threat quarterback blowing out his knee, man, you know that it's pretty tough to project that guy to come back to actually 100% of what he was 1 year after the injury. That means, hey, never mind ever if he gets there. But I think if Spencer Brash is still the number 1 quarterback, then I will definitely be wrong in this pick because the dude just doesn't have the judgment to not throw the picks he did last season. With Sam Heward, look, this is the story of a lot of Big Sky dropdowns of, hey, there's excitement that this big name blue chip dude whose pedigree kind of feels like he shouldn't be in the Big Sky. That guy's a recruit like that coming to the Big Sky. I mean, the only higher level recruit in our time covering the Big Sky who came here is Dylan McCaffrey. But Dylan McCaffrey came to Northern Colorado because he just wasn't good. He was always overvalued from day one. That's the thing we don't know about Sam Heward. Is he good and this is a rehab year for him? Or is he just actually not that talented? And part of it was his name and going to camps and all that kind of stuff that got him to where he was at University of Washington. I don't know, but those two options are both equal to me. Until we see otherwise, both those options are equally on the table. But for Cal Poly, it's going to be a catastrophe if Sam Heward does not have the ability to take over that job, because that's where you would point to how Cal Poly could turn around, because it would take the recruitment they would need defensively would be something we just haven't seen in 4 or 5 years out of Cal Poly. Because last season, man, they made Eastern Washington on the ground look like one of the tougher defenses in the Big Sky, and Eastern was absolutely awful defending the run. But I know you have a pick that you're going to make in a second, and we're going to get to our ad read. So Martin, we got to talk about Snake River Stampede. My bad. We're going to talk about Snake River Stampede. Amateur Hour. We're going to talk about something. Okay. Hughes River has been sponsoring Tubs of the Club absolutely forever. Colin Hughes is a kick-ass vandal. So here's the thing about Hughes River, guys. If you are interested in any sort of river vacation, any sort of rafting trip, there is only one place to look. It's Hughes River. They've been Vandal owned and operated since 1976. They run all-inclusive trips. So truly, you show up. They take care of everything else. You just get there on your own. It doesn't matter if you are a corporate-oriented retreat or you're doing this as a large kind of team-building type of exercise. They got you covered. If you're just a family who wants to have a good time out on the river and you don't want to have to deal with all the packing and all that other shit, they got you covered. So it doesn't matter if you're a small group or huge group. Hughes River is the single best expedition company to go with. You got to get a hold of Colin Hughes. Call him now at 800-262-1882 or check him out at hughesriver.com. Amateur Hour, guys. Dallas, you're up.
All right. So now that we've gotten through the first 4 teams in the conference, we're looking at pick number 8. I'm going to have to take Northern Colorado here. And this is a lot of projection, guys. This is a team that could absolutely finish dead last in this conference. I think that this is probably close to their ceiling, finishing towards the middle of the pack. But realistically, the biggest upgrade that anybody made this year is firing Ed McCaffrey and the bunch of his family, and we're just replacing them with competent talent and competent coaching. So Ed Lamb, who won the Big Sky with Southern Utah a handful of years back, spent a lot of time at BYU after that. He's come back down to Northern Colorado. And Ed Lamb has opened up competition at all positions. While we could expect somebody like Jacob Sermon, who looked considerably better than Dylan McCaffrey every single time he got to see the field, while we could expect that guy could be the quarterback, I mean, we really don't know. Their whole offense mostly turned over. Their defense does return a handful of guys. They've got David Hogue returning from injury. He missed all of last year. He was named to the preseason All-Big Sky team this year. He was an All-American in 2021. They've got another All-Conference defender in Jordan Napke in the defensive in the secondary. They have a handful of guys that are really talented, but we just never saw anything really click last year. Really, at this point, Brian, we're projecting that Ed McCaffrey was playing favorites, obviously, because Dylan McCaffrey got to play a ton and Max got to coordinate 2 years of an offense that it showed he had no business doing. We're really projecting that the talent that stayed is good enough to surpass being 3-8. Their schedule is a little bit better for them this year. They have at ISU, at Cal Poly, and at NAU, and then as well Portland State at home. So it's tough for them that they do go on the road for 3 of their more winnable games. But realistically, this probably should be a better team than we saw last year, just in the fact that you replaced the coach. I'm not thinking that this is going to be an Idaho-level resurgence where you fire an idiot and you bring in a guy that's really good at his job, and lo and behold, you make the playoffs in year one. I don't think that's going to happen with Northern Colorado, but I do think that they're going to be closer to an Idaho level. We brought in a new guy. He turned the program around rather than we brought in Charlie Raggle. He said everything here sucks. He was technically right, but he left us high and dry. I think Ed Lamb is going to be much closer to Jason Eck than he was to, honestly, either Rob Fennessy or any of the guys that have been at Idaho State and not turned the program around. I do think Ed Lamb is going to start turning this program into something decent. This just might not be the year. It's all kind of projection at this point.
Of course, with a new coach's projection, but your projection for Ed Lamb is based off a guy in this conference at a non-marquee school doing well. He made the playoffs twice at Southern Utah, both in 2013 and 2015. He was actually the head coach of Southern Utah when they transitioned from D2 to the Big Sky. So bring that up because the dude's handled instability, and he's been previously good at a non-marquee school in the Big Sky. So if there's a guy for Northern Colorado to go to after the Ed McCaffrey dumpster fire, which, by the way, RIP to my Twitter account on Saturdays, because making fun of Ed McCaffrey was absolutely fun. Ed Lamb is not that dude. I'm not going to say he's the best coach in the Big Sky, but immediately Northern Colorado has a respectable guy on the sidelines where you're not thinking as a fan, okay, well, this is a freebie because the school absolutely has no idea what they're doing. Another thing I want to talk about Northern Colorado, it's still incredible to me. And I know, look, Idaho is getting better with their OOC schedules. Northern Colorado, for the at least minimum of the third year in a row, they have 2 FCS out of conference games. They have at Abilene Christian and they host Incarnate Word. Now they'll probably get their ass kicked by Incarnate Word. I don't know anything about Abilene Christian. They're in the WAC and I don't care about the WAC, but it's just weird. It's wild for me to think about a non-marquee school like UNC has an out of conference schedule that is in theory more favorable than Idaho's still. I do think the schedule, I kind of disagree with you on the schedule doing no favors to Northern Colorado. And the reason why is, look, if Northern Colorado is going to beat one of the better teams in the conference, they're going to have to do it at home and they're going to need the other team to face plant. So Northern Colorado, if they're going to pull off weird upsets, they at least have, look, they've got Idaho, they've got Sac State, they've got Weber State at home, and they should beat Portland State to close out the year. That means on the road, though, like they do get some teams that suck on the road. And I know in theory, road teams it's a struggle for road teams to win. But look, if you're Northern Colorado, I think talent wise, you feel fine traveling to Idaho State and maybe picking up some upset wins. This is exactly why, look, I went back and forth on want to do Cal Poly or Northern Colorado. I absolutely think as far as maybe a structural setting, Northern Colorado has a chance to be the kind of team that they're not going to make the playoffs, no prayer. But I think they have enough talent to maybe upset one of the handful of Big Sky teams that consider themselves fringe playoffs and knock them out. Because it's, again, last year, Northern Colorado was a dumpster fire walkover game for most teams. And at the very least, this is going to be a team that has a reasonable system, has a reasonable type of focus, which I think is cool. I think I like the Big Sky with more competitive teams for us to be playing against. But you already talked about some of the big guys that are going to be contributors this year on the offensive side. They had a ton of guys graduate who were, like Elijah Dotson is gone. So they had some big names graduate. We don't know who are going to be the contributors, but I think Northern Colorado is at least a team worth paying attention to this season.
Brian, I think, I know that we just 2 teams ago had said we're out of the bottom of the conference. We're getting into some of those more middling teams. I think we're already out of that. I think ever so slightly. Your draft pick is up next. I have a feeling that of who you're going to pick. I think this team is a notch above all the teams we've talked about, but maybe still outside of I would say the final 6 teams are all playoff contenders in the Big Sky. I think the team that you're about to pick is somewhere in the middle of those. Who are you picking, Brian?
It hurts my heart so much to say this, that first off, the team Martin accidentally flashed on the screen, #producing seducing, was correct. It's Eastern. Eastern Washington. This is a team that if we were to just talk about the season's narratives, this is one of the more compelling teams to me, which is this is a very important year for Aaron Best. One, there's no reason to know about this, guys, unless you're playing inside baseball. Eastern's doing a way better job raising money now than they have in the last decade. So that athletic department, I'm not saying they're rich, but they're not as poor as you might guess. Check out Martin's got their schedule up. Their OOC, 2 FCS games. Yeah, sure. North Dakota State's going to beat them. And then Southeastern Louisiana, probably going to beat them too. Like, those are 2 tough games. But hey, that's 2 FCS OOC games. They didn't need a Power 5. But the basic trajectory of Aaron Best has been took over for Beau Baldwin, made the 08 final, and it's been a gradual trend downward that COVID actually probably propped up for an extra year by keeping guys like Barrier and Talolo Limu-Jones there for an extra year. Last year, Eastern fell off a cliff. And if you guys remember from the game Idaho played against Eastern, traveled to the Dome and just got embarrassed by Idaho talent-wise. Look, Eastern's brought in a bunch of transfers as of late, that with especially the goal propping up the defensive side of the ball. But hey, I think Eastern has transitioned from a team you bet on to a team you say, you guys got to prove it. And I agree with your basic assessment earlier, Dallas, is Eastern they should be better than all the teams we just talked about. Like, there should be at least a little bit of a talent gap, and whatever problems you have with Aaron Best as a program builder, he's certainly not like the worst in-game coach the league has. But I am also confident agreeing with you that there's also, until Eastern proves it, there's a pretty big gap between Eastern and the next team.
And honestly, Brian, I think a lot of this, and I mean no shot at Gunnar Talkington. I'm sure he was a great dude. Gunnar Talkington was a game manager last year. Eastern's defense is always pretty mediocre at absolute best. Aaron Best. There we go. The bottom completely fell out of that offense once Barrier graduated. It's just not the same thing watching Gunnar Talkington run that offense. This year, the quarterback should be Kikoa Vesperis. He started the final game of the season. It was against UNC when Ed McCaffrey was in full final meltdown mode. But he went 17-21, 235 yards, 2 touchdowns, had 33 rushes or 33 yards on the ground, and then a touchdown as well. If he comes in and shows off that explosiveness, and is that I'm not going to list all the names, but in more recent memory, like the Vernon Davis, Gage Gubrud, Eric Barrier style of really owning that offense. I know Barrier was a little bit less explosive than maybe the other 2 guys were, but being able to run, being able to keep the game moving, just seeing what you'd expect out of an Eastern offense. That might still happen. Vesperis might be the guy. He might be right back to just what Eastern's quarterback play typically is. The problem is their defense is pretty putrid. Their schedule does them absolutely no favors because, again, you're looking at their out of conference and they're going to lose against North Dakota State. Sorry, Patty. They're probably going to lose against Southeastern Louisiana. I know it's a home game. I know traveling to Cheney can be tough because of the wind and the weather, and it's tough to win in Cheney sometimes. It's probably not a winnable game. You're definitely not going to beat Fresno State, so you're already 0-3. Then you look at the conference schedule. You've got UC Davis, Idaho, Weber State, Montana State. You're going to have to knock off multiple of those teams to be able to get into the playoffs. It just feels like there's a really rough shot at that but this at least might be the pulling out of that 3-8 year last year might be at least a little bit more respectable. Maybe they pick off. I'm not saying I think they're going to pick off Idaho. I'm not saying I want them to pick off Idaho, but weird shit happens in Cheney. It just does. That's a game that they might be able to pick off. They might be able to pick off Weber State at homecoming because they've certainly upset Weber State in Bruce Field before. But when you look at the schedule and you look at all the what's coming back from the defense, there are some guys that are preseason award winners. There's guys that are really good contributors. Derek Tomasini, former Vandal, is one of them. They've got 4 returners on the offensive line. They bring back most of their offense. They've got a bunch of good pieces that you can say, yeah, maybe there's something here. But when you look at the schedule and when you look at just the downward trajectory Eastern's been on the last handful of years, it just doesn't feel like this team has a shot at playoffs.
Yeah, and hey, I really want to hit on a point that I'm glad you brought up, Dallas, because off the top of my head, I didn't remember Eastern's offense last season being like an abomination or something like that. But in reference to what they typically had been, which is for years, number 1 or number 2 scoring offense, number 1 or number 2 overall offense, no exception. Last season, Eastern was the number 9 scoring team, 9 out of 12 teams in the Big Sky, 25.5 points per game. Total offense, Eastern was like a little bit better at number 7 at 400, but 400 yards per game. But that's a mediocre overall, like, hey, middle of the pack, to scoring not mediocre, just not a very good scoring offense last season. And they had the second worst rushing defense you and I will ever see. Cal Poly is the one who owns that honor from last season. But another story within Eastern to me that's intriguing is, like, you talked about the schedule, and Eastern's schedule to me is more or less divided pretty cleanly in half. They have their bye week is October 7th. Eastern, absolutely, if they're going to salvage this season in any sort of way, they have to beat a pretty good team early in the year. Because if Eastern doesn't, that team is going to be not going to have a winnable game until Idaho State on October 14th. Your culture is done if you're going to lose a month and a half of the season before a win. Like, your morale is done if you're going to go that far into the season. Because the second half of the year, it's not like every week is easy for Eastern, but it lightens up quite a bit once they get over that once they get to that Idaho State hump after the October 7 bye week. They still have Weber and Montana State, like you said, but they have winnable games: Idaho State, Portland State, Cal Poly, and NAU. That's 4 of their last 6 weeks. But they have a gauntlet the first half of the season with the FCS OC games you already talked about, plus they've got Fresno State, plus Idaho and UC Davis are their first 2 conference games. So the other story within Eastern to me is, can they scrape by enough in the first half of the season that you can understand how there might be a push to 5 or 6 wins and, like, at least a fringe, not going to make the playoffs, but they can pretend they are kind of season. I don't know if Eastern doesn't get to that point. I think we do have a real discussion midseason, like, hey, is Aaron Best going to come back? Because the fan base is starting to have more money in that program. Can Aaron Best, after the dumpster fire of last year, can the athletic department say, oh yeah, hey dude, with no wins through the first entire half of the season, the first 7 weeks of the season, can they really tell the fan base that they're okay with where this is at? Because I don't think they can. And that is why Eastern, to me, narrative wise, is one of the more intriguing teams. There's a lot at stake for Eastern this year, and they just have a gauntlet to get through before they start to see the season soften up whatsoever.
I don't have any other final thoughts on Eastern, Brian. I think we wrapped it up pretty well. I know this is going to hurt Patty in the comment section, but I really do think that we're going to be talking in middle October. We're going to be talking, is Aaron Best coming back? I think Aaron Best is a good coach. I just don't know. I don't know what's wrong over there. I just don't think they're going to start out more than Captain 58 said it perfectly. If Eastern's 0-4, we're looking at a potential trap game when Idaho visits Cheney. Well, if Idaho gets through that trap game, we're talking 0-5 for Eastern. There's obviously season's dead in the water at that point. You risk losing the team. Does everything fall apart? And do they win 2-3 games and fire Best and just reboot the whole thing? Who knows? let's move on. We're already 40 minutes in.
Yeah.
We've still got about half the conference to talk about.
This
is where I am gonna.
Just one last bullet point really quick. We haven't hit the names of transfers. Patty brought it up in the comment section. It's because there's a shit ton of transfers. Aaron Best knows he's got to do something. There's a lot of JUCO transfers coming to Eastern too. Those guys are there to compete to start because they didn't have the talent they needed.
So, Brian, this is where I am going to. So, if anybody, any of the Tubbs diehards are following along, we picked the first or the worst 6 teams in the conference the exact same way we did our way too early rankings way back in May before we shut down for our offseason. This is where I'm going to throw a big old curveball. I am going to pick at number 6 the Weber State Wildcats. Weber State went 10-3 last year. They lost to Montana State in the second round of the FCS playoffs. Realistically, they should have beat Montana State in the regular season if their long snapper hadn't sent 4 different punts over the punter's head. Really talking about a completely different trajectory for that team if that doesn't happen. They only lost to Montana State by 8 in the second round. They felt like they had gotten jobbed from that. Montana State felt like they got jobbed from that game. A whole bunch of drama around it, but as essentially what happens, Jay Hill goes to BYU as a coordinator. Mickey Mental, the first-year offensive coordinator, gets promoted up to head coach. They did keep most of the coaching staff intact. They kept their co-defensive coordinators. They did lose a little bit of talent, though. Their best defender, Eddie Heckard, went on to BYU with Jay Hill. Quarterback Bronson Barron is now at FBS Western Kentucky. And that's where things lie to me. The defense should be good because the defense in Weber is always good. They're always so solid at linebacking play, and their linebacking play. The Weber State Weekly guys think their defensive line should be better, but I am concerned at their quarterback position. Kylan Weiser is the guy that's the expected starter. Last year, he went 16 for 28, 160 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. I know that the quarterback play is not what they are expecting to be the driving force at Weber. It never has been. Maybe with Mickey Mental getting to take the clamps off and run the show his way, maybe things will work out. They have a bunch of offensive line experience. They have a bunch of talent. Their schedule lines out pretty easy. They've got at Northern Colorado, NAU, at Eastern, at ISU, at Cal Poly. They have everything they need to make a pretty good shot here in the conference. But when you look at the other 6 teams, there's these 6 teams that are all playoff contenders. To me, when we start talking about the other 5, I think Weber State is the one that's on the outside looking in because I just don't believe that they have the quarterback right now. And I think that's going to be a big problem for them. You can only go as far as the quarterback's going to take you. I know that that's different at this level of football because you can build good teams without great quarterbacks. But when your quarterback play is not particularly solid, things are just going to be tough. And looking at what the other 5 teams bring to the table, Brian, I've got to pick Weber State 6th.
So, look, can I rephrase what you just said about quarterbacks? Because you, of course, know – because you've been covering the Big Sky, there's certainly teams who don't get a ton out of quarterback play who do well, like Montana State. Montana State's may advance deep in the FCS playoffs last handful of years with quarterbacks who don't really throw very much. What you're saying is, hey, no, it's not that you think Kyle Weiser is just kind of serviceable. You think he probably sucks based off what you've seen so far. And you don't necessarily believe that Weber's got the offensive line to allow them to rack up points like a Montana State team, even though, look, they have one of the more talented running backs in the league coming back. Damon Bankson rushed for 709 yards last year and 8 touchdowns. The reporting that we've been given from the Weber State dudes is offensively, they're probably going to run a lot more RPO this year. But the question is, like, one, hey, is Weiser good enough to do that in the first place? Second, a point that I'm going to get to, because it's a similar question, is Weber lost Ty McPherson to graduation. He was one of the better receivers in the league last year. Their receiver room is a bunch of unproven dudes. So I don't know if they have necessarily the skill set, the skill position players to do what Mental is going to want to do. I do think Weber's still going to be strong defensively. I wouldn't have put them here because I think if they're going to have a step back defensively, I think it's going to take a couple of years, because they still have a ton of Jay Hill talent. There's still a little bit of that Jay Hill culture that even if they lose it, it's not going to be all gone this year. But I think what you are hitting on is Weber went with a continuity hire. in bringing in Mental. Mental had only been there for 1 year, but it let essentially all other position guys stay where they were at. I think for Weber to be competing for a playoff spot, also when they lose a week to playing D2 Central Washington, as far as like being a playoff team, and that's the culture of Weber State right now, I think they're going to have to get some offensive developments that I don't think we should bet on until we actually see it. Because I don't think this team's going to struggle defensively, Dallas. But look, Jay Hill they're also going to take a step back on special teams too. Like it was going to be virtually impossible for that not to happen. Weber always picked up a couple extra first downs or scores on special teams, other than the Montana State anomaly you brought up. But for years, Weber State has had the best special teams in the conference. It's a real question because they don't have Jay Hill was the special teams play caller. He's gone. I don't know how much they're going to lose there, but to me, that's actually probably the biggest loss for this team heading into this season. Is part of what buttressed their offense a bit was getting offensive production on special teams. I don't know if they're going to get it this year.
Yeah, as you say that, Abraham Williams, the kick returner, was named the Big Sky preseason kick returner. He had 898 yards on kick returns last year and 4 touchdowns. That is a ton of production for a team that was very, very inconsistent offensively. I believe in Mickey Mental. I believe in what he's going to end up putting together there, especially from the inside scoop we've got from the Weber State Weekly guys. I think that the young quarterbacks they have there are going to turn things around and kind of build that offense being a little bit more consistent than they have been. But when you look at a team that's loaded at offensive line, at least there are a bunch of seniors there. Again, like you said, Damon Bankston's one of the best running backs in the conference, but then you're talking about an unproven quarterback and a bunch of receivers that really don't have a ton of playing time. You're really rolling the dice here on those position groups. And to me, we're going to get into the 5 teams that are to follow. And I know, Brian, you wouldn't have picked Weber here, and I know where you're going with next, and I know this is where you and I are going to have a little bit more disagreement, but it's really tough to bet on Weber State knowing there are those big question marks when I think the other teams have less question marks or more manageable question marks than what Weber State has.
No, I think if you were betting higher on Weber State, your belief is that defensively they're going to continue to be very strong, and that the continuity hires will result in Weber not really taking a step back defensively. So offensively and special teams wise, they don't have to be that good. The case against that, of course, is like, okay, well, they're going to lose some of their offensive production in special teams. Special teams, their production, it wasn't just in kick returns, man. It was in stuff like fake punts. Like Weber State reliably picked up first downs virtually every week off shit like fake punts. So like there was actual offensive production on that end of the ball. And I don't know if it's going to be there. The team.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's cool. You go. No, I was going to shift to my next team.
Okay. The one other thing I did want to point out, Weber State does have the preseason defensive MVP and linebacker Winston Reed. Had 112 tackles last year, 12.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks. One of the absolute best players in the conference. Forced 5 fumbles last year as well. Defensively, they should still be solid. There's no question about that. Defensively, the worst that they're going to be is top third of the conference. They should be a very good defensive team. Anyways, Brian.
Well, and we're in the realm of teams, guys. If you've been paying attention to Big Sky forever, you already know this. But if you're a newer listener, we're now talking about the teams that year in and year out are expecting to make the playoffs. So like the discussion for Weber State is if they miss the playoffs, that's a disappointing season for their fan base. That's a representative step backward. This is still going to be a good football team. This is still going to be a team that when Idaho plays Weber State, it's going to be tough. Idaho is absolutely not going to be the type of team who's ever going to look past Weber State. Weber State, until proven otherwise, they're a team, no matter what, you can't look past them because there's a baseline of talent there, especially on the defensive side of the ball, that's going to make that matchup tough all the time. My pick.
Brian, I do have one last interruption. We just got to keep talking about Weber State here. Their schedule does not do them any favors. I do want to shout that out very quickly. They have Division II Central Washington, so that's a completely worthless game. They have number 14 in the FBS, Utah State. They also have an away game at Northern Iowa. Not a super helpful out-of-conference schedule for them, for a team that, again, you got to get 7 wins to get to the playoffs. Not super helpful when you have a game that doesn't count, doesn't matter, a tougher FCS opponent, and then a road FBS game that should eat you alive.
So the pushback I give you is I don't think anyone right now, at least on this show, thinks Weber is a team that we would bet to win the conference. Like a good Weber season is probably analogous to like Idaho's results last season. And Martin, thanks for having this. You got the schedule up. The thing I want to point to is once they get out of their OOC. So they open up with Montana State. But if you look through after that, you got Northern Colorado, NAU, UC Davis, Eastern. And I'm going to pause there for a second. They have the type of schedule that in conference season could build momentum. Where like, hey, maybe they lose to Montana State, because at this point you should expect them to lose to Montana State, but they follow that up with 2 winnable games before they hit a couple of those like okay to pretty good teams that they're going to play. And if Weber can have the momentum to pull off wins against Davis and Eastern, well, then you're looking at 4-0 in conference. They follow that up with Idaho State. It's entirely on, sorry, the 1-4, 4-1 in conference because they would have lost Montana State. You're looking at a team that has rolled off like 4 or 5 conference wins in a row. It's honestly the opposite of Eastern in that it does set them up to look. They'll have to beat Idaho later in the year, but once they get through UC Davis Eastern, it's really just the Idaho conference game that you'd look at and think, hey, maybe this is a loss for Eastern. So they have in some ways the schedule hurts them early, but in the middle of the season, I think the schedule sets them up to potentially take a developmental step if they can pull off a couple of those wins. But that's also going to cycle back to the stuff we talked about earlier. Are they going to be able to get enough points? That's the question year in, year out. And Mickey Mental is going to be there's no way for Mental to not be a more aggressive play caller than Jay Hill was, and to essentially be able to do what he wants to this year. Because even as an OC, like, hey, you're a little bit subservient to the guy who always, every head coach always has the ability to nix your play call or tell you what you're going to call within. Just ask the dudes at Montana how that works. But I'm ready for the next team because it's a team that I think is in a very similar boat to Weber State. They got a new head coach, a lot of question marks. That's Sacramento State. And Sacramento State, look, the story, of course, Andy Thompson takes over, had been defensive coordinator, now is head coach. We don't know if they're going to do the complete bifurcation of coaching duties like they did under Troy Taylor, where Troy Taylor was the offensive head coach and Andy Thompson was the defensive head coach. We don't know. And that's one of the big questions for Sacramento State is they lost, if not the best offensive coach in the league, the second best offensive coach in the league. We don't know what their replacement's going to be. We know there might be some structural changes. Team also lost a lot on the offensive side of the ball to graduation and transfer. Both their quarterbacks graduated. Cameron Scadaboo transferred to Arizona State. Pierre Williams, first team all Big Sky level wide receiver, graduated. Marshall Martin, easily the best tight end in the Big Sky, maybe the FCS, is still there. So hey, that's something. There's a lot of offensive question marks. Schedule wise, they have a little bit. Their schedule's okay. I mean, they've got Nicholls State and Texas A&M Commerce in the OOC before Stanford, and a matchup against their old head coach Troy Taylor to close out the OOC. So I mean, that's a world where there's a couple wins that help this team stabilize. But I think Sacramento State has more questions to answer than Weber State as far as a new coach taking over, especially with how the offensive footprint of this team could change. Troy Taylor was pretty damn good about making whatever he had work. And it's not like he lacked talent at Sacramento State while he was here, but his teams varied radically year to year based off the available talent. And whether they can replace that in any, or what percentage of it they can replace, to me, is probably going to dictate what this team is for the coming season.
So my pushback here, Brian, I wouldn't have picked Sacramento State here. I actually have Sacramento State in the top 4 teams in the conference. Andy Thompson's still around, obviously the defensive coordinator last year. Their offense was kind of the glamour between the dual quarterback system and Scadaboo absolutely running wild most of last year. They've brought back almost their entire defense. They lost Marty Mapu, who's now he was a 3rd-round pick of the New England Patriots. So that's unfortunate, but they bring back almost their entire defense. And then on the offense, they do have, like you said, Marshall Martin, the best tight end at this level. Honestly, one of the best tight ends in Big Sky history. He's been an All-American twice. There's just not many guys better than him at this level of football. Even in the FBS, I think he'd be one of the top tight ends. Marcus Fulcher, the backup to Scadaboo, looked pretty good last year. He was all Big Sky third team last year. He was named to the preseason team this year, had 464 yards and 10 touchdowns. They did lose again Pierre Williams. It's tough. They did bring back Jared Gibson, who was decent last year. They have a little bit more receiving depth. They do have 3 all-conference linemen that have returned, along with actually most of the rest of their offensive line. To me, their big questions are quarterback and running back. Are they going to be able to fill Scadaboo and the dual quarterback system? The quarterback thing is going to be interesting. They brought in Carson Camp from South Dakota. He's thrown for over 4,000 yards in his career, has 24 touchdowns. They brought in a junior college running back who had 1,400 yards and 18 touchdowns last year. But to me, Brian, it's looking at the schedule. I'm kind of going off of schedules here. Sacramento State's got a heck of a schedule. Nichols and Texas A&M should both be wins. There's 2 FCS wins banked in your first 2 weeks. Again, assuming that they come out and are at least a top half Big Sky team. They should be 2-0. Obviously, you expect that they lose to Stanford. If they don't, if somehow that they pull that win off, all of a sudden you're looking at 3-0 and you're going into Idaho. And then after that, you've got NAU, Northern Colorado, Idaho State, and Cal Poly all on the docket. This, to me, is a really, really favorable schedule for Sacramento State. I think that is going to help them a lot as they are trying to build some sort of new offensive continuity. I think Sacramento State's going to be pretty good. They ended up, they're in the top 10 in both the media and the coaches poll. I know that, again, we're at this point we're really nitpicking here. All of 6 of these teams have votes in the Big Sky or in the top 25 polls. All 6 of these teams realistically are going to be disappointed if they don't make the playoffs. I think Sacramento State has so much talent coming back from what playoffs. Don't forget. Let's forget about the playoffs. Don't think about that. Let's focus on the regular season. This is 3 straight conference titles. I don't think they're going to make it 4, but they did bring back most of the core other than, again, the quarterbacks, the running back, and their top receiver, their top defender. Lost some good pieces, but there is a ton of talent still here.
See, and now I'm really pissed that, full disclosure, Dallas was doing the legwork on research here, because now, you've completely talked me off the ledge. And here's why. We're obviously not going to change our picks because we've already talked about the team. But I'm going to talk about why Dallas just talked me off the ledge. One, if Sac State was strong on the offensive line, if those guys are all back, running backs graduate and they get replaced. If they get 85% of Scadaboo's production, they're fine. Second, Camp sounds like, and I looked up his stats too now, Camp might be a better passer than either quarterback that Sacramento State had last year. So here's the case for if Sacramento is going to be going to look better than I initially thought, is those things materialize. Losing the Big Sky Defensive Player of the Year is going to matter. But you're right, there is a good amount of talent, and maybe I should understand this team I just described Weber State, of it might take a little bit longer for Sac State to complete. If they're going to fall apart, it might take Sac State a little bit longer because they do have a lot of dudes coming back. I still think the question about how the offense itself is actually handled is a huge deal for Sacramento State, because, again, I cannot stress this enough. Troy Taylor probably should have been understood as the best coach of the Big Sky in every single year that he was at Sacramento State. I cannot stress this enough. Troy Taylor was able to adjust what Sacramento State did. And I know you referenced ignore the playoffs. No, don't ignore the playoffs. Sacramento State made the final 8 last season and played maybe the single most fun playoff game of the entire season and barely lost to Incarnate Word. Those were both 2 very good teams. Sacramento State, I know the narrative around Sacramento State is hey, they won the league twice, only won 1 playoff game. They made the final 8. If your team hasn't made the final 8, then shut the fuck up. Look, the question mark's real for Sacramento State, but I'm fine going on the record. I screwed up picking them here. I think maybe the team we pick next is who I should have gone with. But before we go to the team we're going to pick next, Snake River Stampede Canadian whiskey dudes. They're the show sponsor of Tubbs the Club. They make, I'm going to be a broken record saying the words I cannot stress. I cannot stress enough. Snake River Stampede is one of the single best buys in Idaho liquor stores. It's Canadian whiskey. It's distilled in Canada, blended in the United States, got a double finishing process, finished in ex-bourbon barrels and first fill Oloroso sherry casks. It's got some of the like wood bourbon notes from the bourbon flavor. It's got like corn sweetness from the Canadian whiskey itself. And then it has this additional kind of cherry candied finish that I think is probably from the Oloroso sherry cask finish. Not only is it a whiskey that I exclusively buy by the handle, it is one of the best buys in Idaho State liquor stores. You absolutely need to give Snake River Stampede a look. If you haven't tried that out for tailgating, this is the year to do it. Snake River Stampede Canadian whiskey. Supporting Tubbs the Club, supporting your Vandals.
So, Brian, I'm obviously the next pick. Picking, again, we're in the top 4 here, guys. Picking at team number 4. I would have flipped this with team number 5. I got to take Montana at number 4. Again, we're really, really diverting from where our way too early rankings are now that we're really doing the research here. So for anybody that doesn't know, Montana went 8-5 last year. They bought a playoff home game that they probably shouldn't have had. They got shredded by North Dakota State after they won that bullshit home game. Bobby Hauck fired his defensive coordinator. He demoted his offensive coordinator to offensive analyst, promoted new coordinators within it. Hopefully, it's just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. There is rumblings. A lot of fans are not super thrilled with how Bobby Hauck's second run at Montana has been going. I think that's kind of hilarious because realistically, I would have killed for what Bobby Hauck is doing right now. But, different expectations for that program. When you look at what they've got coming back, yes, they lost their quarterback. Yes, they lost a bunch of pass catchers. They bring back their entire offensive line. Like, legitimately, their entire offensive line is back. All of the starters and most of the depth are back. They have Nick Osmo was pretty solid at running back. Isaiah Childs was pretty decent behind him. They should have a pretty good run game. They do have some decent receivers still there. They had a lot of depth there, Junior Bergen being one of them. He's not even really playing a lot of receiver anymore, but he was the preseason punt returner of the year. He had 2 touchdowns off of 330 yards returning punts last year. Their defense, they bring back a ton of guys. They lose Robbie Hauck, so their defense actually is going to get better from graduation than most schools get worse when they lose players. Montana's certainly going to be getting better. They have transfer quarterbacks coming in. Sam Vidlak from Boise State, Clifton McDowell from Central Arkansas. So again, they're rolling the dice with the new quarterback. They're rolling the dice that maybe their internal shift around is going to awaken something in their offense. Realistically, I think this is going to be the same Montana team we see every year. Their offense I honestly think if you asked Bobby Hauck, what do you think of offense? He would say, screw offense. He doesn't care. He's going to focus on defense and special teams. They should be very solid at that, just like they always are. They have a pretty easy schedule again. They're going to pick off Butler and Utah Tech. There's 2 FCS wins, bam, right off to start the year. They do have Ferris State, who's D2, that they're just going to absolutely pummel. Then they have Northern Arizona and Idaho State on the docket. They have Northern Colorado and Portland State. Like, getting this team to 7 wins in the playoffs is not going to be terribly difficult for them. They've got to pick off one of UC Davis, Idaho, Sac State, and Montana. Realistically, if every other game goes the way that the chalk says, you got to go 1-4 or 1-3 in your 4 hardest games, and you're in the playoffs. I think Montana makes the playoffs. I don't know if they're going to collapse the way that maybe we're all hoping they do. Brian, you're a little bit closer to Montana. I know you've got some more family ties than I do. What are your thoughts on the Montana Grizz?
So a couple minor things I want to adjust. So Junior Bergen is he's probably going to be their number 2 receiver. Like he's very good as a punt returner. One of the frustrations from Montana last season was that guys like Junior Bergen were just not getting touches. Like he was playing, he scored a touchdown against Idaho, but
he got 17 catches last year.
Yes, but he's probably going to be their number 2 receiver this season. Brent Peace is their offensive coordinator, and I think really the answer to how Montana's season is going to go is is Bobby Hauck going to actually let a guy like Brent Peace make some different play calls? Because if look, we saw what Bobby Hauck wanted out of the offense last season. It was garbage. It would be hard strategically to be worse than what Montana was last season. And no matter how you feel about Brent Peace, Dallas, he's probably not worse than what Montana trotted out under Tim Rosenball last season. The thing that's different too is like Sam Vidlac is going to be a better passing quarterback than what Montana's had for the last couple seasons. Chris Brown's not. If Chris Brown is starting for Montana, write the season off. He is not a Big Sky level starting quarterback. We've seen it for the last couple seasons. I think Montana should be a little more concerned about Ferris State than you'd guess. They're the reigning D2 champions. So like obviously Montana should walk over Ferris State. But like, there's a world where Ferris State could reasonably beat like Idaho State or someone like that. So that's not a completely nothing game, or in theory, it's not a completely nothing game. But you talk defensively with Robbie Hauck leaving, because Robbie Hauck was an overrated pass defender for sure. Montana is going to struggle to be better against the pass this season than last season. Justin Forbes, an All-American corner, he's gone. After we did our preview last season, essentially the other top two corners from Montana transferred out. So like there's whatever Montana gets at the secondary, it's dudes we haven't seen play that much. So that part's unknown. We do know Montana's going to be physically tough. You're right that Montana's had all Big Sky dudes graduate for forever, and then they get replaced by all Big Sky dudes. Like, hey, preseason 2023, all Big Sky preseason 2023 defensive lineman Alex Gubner had 44 tackles last year, 7 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks. He's obviously going to be, one of the candidates to step up. But I think you are right in that if Montana is going to be good the way Montana has set the standard for them, the way Bobby Hauck is in the branding, you can say, of Montana, has put all the attention on himself. The question is going to be, is Bobby Hauck willing to take a Xanax on the offensive side and get the ball to his wide receivers who are good? Junior Bergen's a good receiver. He'd be a number 1 or number 2 receiver on honestly every team but Idaho, in my mind. Will they spread the ball around? Will they let Sam Vidlac, who is a better pocket passer than any quarterback they've had for the last couple of years, are they going to let Sam Vidlac do what he actually is good at? Or is it going to be last season where Montana sprints into 3rd and long? And I don't know the answer to that question. I know I'm a little concerned that if I'm a Montana fan, I'm concerned that Bobby Hauck has the personal strength to let go of his ego enough. Because I really think, look, we know they just rotated coaching positions instead of firing anyone. Although, dude, they more or less fired their offensive coordinator with the demotion the dude got. I think that's a real question for Montana, because we're at the point where, look, you're picking Montana. Well, this is what was our number 5 pick, Dallas, or number 4 pick, Dallas. Okay. That's way lower than the Montana fan base is expecting because of because of how Bobby Hauck branded his comeback. RTD, return to dominance. Does number 4 sound like dominance?
No, not at all. And that's, Brian, you hit on the biggest thing here. Honestly, when you look at the talent this team has, I think with a better coach, I do think this is a team we're talking about, maybe the 2nd best team in the conference. But when you know that the front 6, because again, they play that 3-3-5, their front 6 defensively is going to be loaded. It always is. It seems like they could lose all starters in that front 6 and they'd still put out a top half Big Sky defense. The secondary, obviously they've lost the corners. I do think that Robbie Hauck leaving means that Nash Fouch and Trajan Cotton are just going to look even better because they're not going to have to cover the gaping black hole in the defense. But if Hauck would let the offense run and adapt to the playmakers rather than try to force the playmakers into the system, this is a terrifying team. I'm not that scared of Montana. Obviously, I mean, Idaho won on the road. Little Big Stein is currently in the Kibbe Dome as we speak. I'm not that afraid of Montana, and I think that's why their fan base, our comment section is going off about how they're the closest thing that we have to the Boise Junior College, where they lose one game and everyone goes up in arms about fire somebody. That's very true. But I do think there is a shred of truth to that. I think if they had a better coach or a younger coach that was a little bit more open to change, Montana would not be in this position that we are talking about them in. I would have picked them 5th, with they're currently 4th here. You and I are both well in agreement that they are not in the top echelon of this conference. It'll be interesting to see what happens. Colin Hughes, one of our favorite sponsors, said, "Do we live in a world where Chris Ball could go 3-8 and survive another year, and Bobby Hauck could win 8 games and get fired?" I do think that's actually on the table because, like you said, Brian, Bobby Hauck came in talking a whole lot of smoke, and all we're seeing is maybe that fire is kind of dying out. There's really not a whole lot to feel confident in. If you're thinking as a Montana fan, we should be competing for the national championship year in and year out, I do not see anything about this team that screams national championship contender.
Now, just a small pushback, because we're not in the Montana fan base. We can talk about the team as they are. Montana's made the playoffs 3 normal seasons in a row. They finished in the top final 8 in 2 of those 3 seasons. And yeah, like I know you said they bought a home game. Well, that's the system. If you can afford to buy a home game, buy it. And Montana won the game. So I mean, like, hey, compared to Idaho, Montana had an objectively better season than Idaho last year. So it's not like this isn't a dumpster fire. A bad Montana team, just like we talked about Weber State, a bad Montana team is a tough team to beat. You know, they're going to do what they can to be physically imposing on the defensive side of the ball. You know that at home, they have a kick-ass environment. They have a very motivated fan base. And this is not a team that lacks talent. A shitty Montana season is still competing for the playoffs. But I think I think there's a reason you and I are clearly talking about Montana as though we don't view them class-wise as they're not amongst the teams that are competing for the title this year. Or even if you think there's only one Big Sky team who can compete for the title, you're not viewing Montana as a team that's probably competing to get into the final 8 this season. And that's because if they're going to do offensively what they did last season, they're not going to be the better teams in the Big Sky. Now, the only last piece of pushback before we shift over to my next team, a few years ago when Bobby Hauck first came here and he had Bob Stitt's guys, they weren't doing the sprint to third and long offense. You know, Samari Toure he made the Green Bay Packers roster. He put up incredible stats at Montana because Bobby Hauck was fine with his guy Dalton Snead throwing it. So your hope would have to be between Brent Peace maybe having a little more gravitas to influence what Bobby Hauck is okay with, and Bobby Hauck reading the writing on the wall. That's how this team can put up some more points. And if this team's going to score some points, suddenly we understand them a little bit differently. But just like the other teams we've talked about, I'm going to bet on that if happening when it happens. And until Bobby Hauck shows that he, again, has the strength to swallow his ego a little bit, he's given you a decade of not doing it. So that's where I am with Montana. And my next team is UC Davis, who I think it's UC Davis and Montana, I think, are kind of fair to toggle back and forth. And I'm going to say Captain 58. He hasn't hit the comment section with this yet, but Captain 58 early was one of the guys who is a little bit higher on UC Davis. So look, here's the thing for you. What UC Davis has going on is they have one of the better coaches in the league. If you don't think Dan Hawkins is the best coach in the league, which I don't think he is, you certainly know he's in the top half of whatever that discussion is. The guy has been essentially only good except Colorado. Davis also they were pretty strong, especially on the offensive line last season. Like if you went to the game in Moscow, the UC Davis game was one of the games where it stood out the most. The growth Idaho still needed if they're going to compete for, against those playoff teams. Davis they've got some talent coming back. They're one of the teams without a quarterback question. Miles Hastings was all Big Sky in 2022, threw for 20 touchdowns and 6 picks. He's back. They lost Alonzo Gilliam to graduation. He's the best running back in program history. But Land Larison's probably going to pick up some of that slack. Ran for just under 500 yards last season. They did lose, and you'll give me the name when you go, Dallas. Essentially lost one of the most talented tight ends in the Big Sky, transferred to Tennessee last season. You know who I'm talking about.
McAllen Castles.
McAllen Castles, thank you. He's gone. He transferred out. So like they did lose some. But this UC Davis team, they were fringe playoff last season, talent-wise. I think they probably should have made the playoffs, but that's not how playoff selections necessarily work. Look at their OOC. They've got Texas A&M Commerce. They get their ass kicked by Oregon State, but then they get Big Sky, former Big Sky member Southern Utah before they open up their season with Eastern and Cal Poly to, in theory, if they're good, immediately start with 4 FCS wins in their first 5 weeks before they get to any sort of challenge in their schedule, which Davis doesn't have the roughest schedule in the Big Sky whatsoever. Dallas, you'll probably hit more of that. But look, the last few seasons, UC Davis has been objectively good, but not great. And I think there's some continuity for where Davis could maybe take a baby step up to, being a playoff type of team that has a chance to win a game, but not advance much further. And hey, a Big Sky team that makes the playoffs and wins a game, that sounds like your pretty typical number 4 Big Sky team.
Yeah, I mean, last year, honestly, UC Davis probably should have made the playoffs if they hadn't had such a murderer's row schedule. They had FBS Cal, and I know that Cal is a pretty mediocre team in the Pac 4, I guess is what it's going to be now. But they got crushed by Cal week 1. They lost to the FCS national champion South Dakota State Jackrabbits by 2 points. And it was a week 2. Things are definitely different in week 2 than they are in week 12. But lost by 2 in week 2. They lost by 6 at Sacramento State in the Causeway Classic. They lost to Weber State by 5. They did get pasted by Montana State, but this was a team that, I mean, realistically, you're talking single possession games in 3 of their losses that against teams that were playoff teams that were very good teams. They were right there on the edge. And then they bring back 8 starters on each side of the ball. And to me, that is terrifying. This UC Davis team, I think, is the team that's most primed to being the one that upsets a bunch of people and ends up as maybe the second best team in the conference. They have, again, last year he was named the best quarterback in the conference, Miles Hastings. He was the first teamer All Big Sky. He was not named to the preseason team this year because Giovanni McCoy beat him out, which is nice. People projecting McCoy going to be the best quarterback in the conference. But again, Miles Hastings, 20 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 3,000 yards, had a great season. Land Larson had some sort of, I didn't take it down because I didn't think of the stat being important at the time, but he had averaged something like 7 yards a carry. I know that Ulonzo Gilliam was one of the best running backs in Big Sky history, but Land Larson again should come in and do 85% of that or more, and they'll be just fine. They bring back Jake Parks. He was a first-team All-Big Sky lineman in 2021 who got hurt in the Cal game last year. Defensively, they are absolutely loaded. They've got preseason award winners in the secondary. They've got defensive lineman Zach Kennedy that's also a preseason award winner. They are loaded from front to back. And then again, you get into their schedule. They should beat Texas A&M. They should beat Southern Utah. So you're coming in already, again, assuming you lose to a top 25 FBS school, you're coming into conference play already with 2 wins that count towards the playoffs. And then from there, you've got Eastern, you've got Cal Poly, you've got NAU, you've got Portland State, you've got Idaho State. All you have to do is win the games that you're expected to win. If their schedule goes chalk, they're in the playoffs. And then at that point, you're talking about Montana, Weber State, and Sacramento State. You win one of those games, all of a sudden you've got 8 wins and you're on fire. If you somehow win 2 of those games, I mean, you're talking this team could have a seed at this point. Now, they did lose some of their pass catchers. However, they're super deep at receiver. I didn't get super into the research about it. CJ Hutton is their guy that's their top returner. He had 506 yards last year. But they had a bunch of guys that had either 10 receptions or 100-plus yards. Nobody's maybe a superstar receiver, but they have a ton of depth there. Again, when you lose close games like that, typically that tends to even out a little bit the next season. So if UC Davis doesn't lose all those coin flip games, they have an easier schedule. Again, I hate to say it, but Dan Hawkins is a hell of a coach. I don't think Cody was necessarily spectacular at his job. I don't think losing him is going to be the worst thing because, again, Dan Hawkins is the guy running the offense most of the time. Brian, this is the team that concerns me the most out of all the teams in the Big Sky. This is the one that feels like if somebody's going to take a jump and it's not Idaho, this is the team that's going to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because look, you hit the schedule point before I got to it. If UC Davis could not win a single game against a good team, and they'll be at 7 wins. So structurally, they're already set up to be pretty solid. I'm going to hit the comment section real quick. We've got Colin Hughes, UCD's lines look next level in the dome in person. I could see them taking a big leak. Captain 58. Davis is for sure a playoff team, likely a seed. Tom Kendall, UC Davis is top 4 in the Big Sky. I don't have much difference to say other than an extra skill position player is Trent Hawkins. He's kind of their Zach Borisch type of player of can run the ball, catch the ball. They have some trick plays where he plays quarterback as well. So no, dude, a lot of guys to pay attention to, but we've got a final few teams to hit on.
Yeah, and this one, I would love to take this team number 1. I can't do it because the team that we are going to take number 1 is if the national champion is not going to be North Dakota State or South Dakota State, it's going to be that team. So just slotting in at number 2 is the other team left in the conference, our beloved Idaho Vandals. Now, we're obviously not going to get into a super in-depth discussion about the team because we're going to focus our whole next episode on that. At least I think it's our next episode. I haven't looked at our schedule. I apologize. But Idaho is, guys, we are really at the doorstep of Idaho becoming a bully in the Big Sky. I know the conference schedule is not super helpful because you do have Montana State. Luckily, they're both at home. You do have to go to Weber State. That's tough. At Cheney is always something that it terrifies me down to my core because I've seen weird things happen out on that field. You also have Sac State coming in. Like it's not a great schedule for Idaho, but switching out the D2 game for Lamar at least gets you that one extra win that you do need to get to the playoffs. You've got Giovanni McCoy, the Jerry Rice winner, coming back. He should take another leap forward. You've got the preseason MVP in Hayden Hatton. Jermaine Jackson also should have probably been in consideration for that award. I mean, then we're talking Jordan Dwyer is going to be healthy. Michael Graves looks pretty good. Terez Traynor should be healthy. The defense, I know we've lost Paul Moala, but as Coach Eck has said, if you go back and look at Vandal Football on Twitter and see some of the things he's talking about in this camp, he said that last year the bad plays were 5 times more often than not because our guys were getting beat, but because they were doing the wrong things, because they were, a lot of the guys were taught by a moron for the first couple of years in their career. So, of course, Eck comes in and he's got to correct all of this awful coaching. With that said, I still just don't think Idaho has the lines that they need to be able to succeed here. We talked about just heavily about UC Davis, something Tom Kendall and Captain and honestly a handful of different people have jumped in and said the UC Davis lines were absolutely bigger and more physical than Idaho's last year. It was almost tough to watch at times because of just the difference that was there. I think in year 2 of the Eck era, I just don't see the lines being able to hold up against the absolute cream of the crop, like, again, the team that we're going to talk about after this. I think we're still a year, maybe 2 years away from talking Idaho as maybe Big Sky champions, maybe national title contenders. We're on the path to that. I just don't see it being here right now.
Yeah, I would have put Idaho at number 2 as well. And look, the basics that I'll get to that I think people should understand Idaho from. Offensively, Idaho averaged 38.5 points a game in the Big Sky last season. There's no way this team averages fewer than 40 points a game this year. Last season, there was the learning curve, not only of a new coach, but Giovanni McCoy did not have the same flexibility in terms of play calling early in the year that we saw later in the year, where Idaho began trusting McCoy to win games in the second half of the season. McCoy's going to be trusted and maybe expected to win games from day one. So offensively, honestly, this makes me think of some of the old Eastern teams in this sense of Idaho's going to score a shit ton of points. If they don't have the best quarterback in the league, they have the second best quarterback. Easily the best receiving room in the league. I don't think it's close who the number 2 receiving room is. I mean, look, Terez Traynor might not even be the number 3 receiver at Idaho. We still have guys like Jordan Dwyer and Michael Graves who very well may take that spot over Terez Traynor. And Terez Traynor is a former all Big Sky level talent. So and with a dude who can pass him and Jason Eck, I know Luke Schleisner calls the plays, but Jason Eck has been open since day 1 at Idaho. He doesn't precisely have a system. He lets the talent dictate what the team needs to do. I expect this team's going to pass the ball a little bit more than last season, because why would you not with those types of dudes? Defensively, there's two questions. Idaho led the Big Sky in turnover margin last year. It is just mathematically hard to do that year in and year out, or to at least lead the league and force turnovers the way they did last season. It can be hard to do that year in and year out. So can Idaho continue to force turnovers on the other side of the ball? If they can, then this team's fine. Other question is the linebacking group. We know freshmen are going to have to be contributors in the linebackers this season. We know, look, Matthias Bertram looks like he's going to be one of the top linebackers. Well, he's a converted strong safety. I know that's part of what he did last season, but that's what we're looking at to fill in some of the gaps from both graduation and transfer at linebacker. And Idaho had pretty damn talented linebackers last season. So that's a group that they might, if Idaho's linebackers are going to be strong, they're probably going to take some lumps early, especially the younger dudes. But I don't think Idaho's going to be weak defensively. I think the questions, the big thing that matters for Idaho is continuing to force turnovers. But I think secondary wise, this is a very talented group compared to a lot of the Big Sky. And their offense is going to give this team margin for error to win some games. So the question now for Idaho is, look, you and I probably are not concerned whatsoever with around half of Idaho's schedule. Like, they're going to beat Lamar by 100. They're going to beat Eastern. They're going to beat Cal Poly. We're going to beat the not good teams. For Idaho to take the next developmental step, they're going to have to beat better teams. And this is where Idaho's schedule does do them favors. Three out of Idaho's 4 toughest games are at home. Idaho hosts Montana, Montana State, and Sac State. If Idaho's going to pick off some of those good teams that make the playoffs, well, hey, we've got chances at home to do it. So that's where the schedule does do a little bit of favors. But I think what you're looking at, worst case scenario, is a very talented, probably most fun team in the Big Sky to watch this year. And the question is, can they take a developmental step? Wouldn't be shocked at all if this Idaho team finishes with 7 wins like last year, but is developmentally much better than last season's team. But look, Jason X in his second year, we've only seen good stuff out of the coaching staff. Making it happen twice is how great coaches prove that's who they are. Like Troy Taylor at Sac State. This is Jason X challenge now is, hey, I did it once. If I'm great, I got to prove I can do it again. The culture stuff out of Idaho seems great. This is just a good conference. That's the only reason why there's hesitation in our commentary on Idaho.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and honestly, if you look at Idaho's schedule, the Idaho conference is pretty favorable. You have, on the road at Cal, yes, Power 5 school, but if you're going to schedule a Power 5 school that you're hoping to maybe pick off, Cal is probably one of the ones you have the best shot at. I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I'm certainly not going to pick it to happen. But if there's a chance, you've got much more of a chance of picking off Cal than you do Alabama. It's just how it works. Then you've also got Group of 5 Nevada. Nevada was absolutely terrible last year. I don't believe in Ken Wilson at all as the coach. I think I watched Ken Wilson coaching defensively at Wazoo in the early Mike Leach era when defensively they couldn't stop a nosebleed. I think they brought in, hey, he played here, he coached here for 20 years. Let's bring him back and sell the fans good vibes. I think if any team is going to pick off if any FBS school is going to get picked off by an FCS school this year, I think Idaho at Nevada is probably the most likely one to happen. So again, we're looking at a schedule that doesn't do us any favors other than the tough games are at home. Maybe you pick off one of the FBS schools. But Brian, it's very weird going into this season. Last year, obviously, we had the hope that Eck was going to turn things around immediately. I think we predicted Idaho at 5-7 or 6-6 last year, and obviously we're wrong. Thank God. It's very weird going into a season, looking at a schedule, and being like, "Yeah, we should beat up 5-6 of these teams, and as long as the team is improving and can hang with the top tier of this conference, Idaho realistically has a shot to win every single one of these games." And I don't know the last time I thought that. I don't know the last time I thought, again, spoiler alert, we're going to pick Montana State as the number 1 team in the conference. They come to the KB Dome October 28th. Looking at Idaho's schedule, there is a legitimate chance that Idaho is 5-2 here. And if that's the case, I mean, hell, they could be even 6-1. I don't know if I'm going to say that, but there is a legitimate chance that we go into this Montana State game and we're all thinking, hey, this is ripe for an upset. Idaho could knock Montana State off here, and this conference could get nuts. I don't know the last time I ever thought that about a Vandal team, and that's incredible to think about.
Yeah, without diving too much in the schedule, the pushback I have to that is if Idaho in weeks 2, 3, and 4 has Nevada, Cal, Sac State. The Vandals need to not go 0-3 in those games. I think that's important for Idaho and the expectations, the energy of this program. We'll get more in depth into that next week, but that's the scheduling part that I think there's a little concern about. But Idaho doesn't have that many holes. We need to hope the offensive line is stronger. Like Colin referenced when I talked about Colin Hughes' comment earlier with UC Davis. UC Davis's line looked pretty imposing, and Idaho's did not last season. We're going to see. It's going to be important for Idaho to take a developmental step on the offensive line, because I think that's really what's going to dictate, is Idaho truly the number 2 team in the Big Sky? If they make enough of a developmental step, they've got the offense to give them a ton of margin for error, then they just have to be good enough on the defensive side of the ball. And I think there's a world where Idaho is still a strong defensive team for sure. We're all confident in the coaching. We also think the secondary is going to be stronger, and maybe the D-line might be stronger as well. But Idaho being a little bit too vulnerable over the middle is where you and I have our reservations, starting freshman, knowing we're going to have a freshman starter at linebacker for sure. So we're going to talk about Idaho for like an hour plus next week. So I'm good putting that there. And then honestly, Montana State to me is weirdly like the least, number 1 Montana State for us, one of the least interesting teams, because they're just good. That's the level Montana State is at. We could talk about their skill position players. It almost doesn't matter, because what Montana State does is beat the shit out of you on the offensive line. And then it does not matter who their running back is. Like, hey, they lost Isaiah Fonse. He transferred to San Jose State. Well, who cares? He missed off last season anyway. And Montana State was, look, they advanced. They made a deep playoff run, guys. Montana State's pretty damn good. They've got both Tommy Mellott and Sean Chambers. They both should be healthy, with Coach Brent Vegan knowing that both of those dudes can line up at quarterback, or they have the dudes line up together. They can also know that if one gets hurt, it doesn't matter. Because honestly, I think Sean Chambers is better than Tommy Mellott from what we saw last season. But Tommy Mellott probably has the locker room and has the state of Montana. So it looks like Mellott's probably going to be the starter, because why would he not be? But this Montana State team can absolutely punish you on the ground. They can pass enough. But that's not how this Montana State team wins, is they annihilate you on the ground. But then this is also a very talented defensive team. It was the number 1 score. Sorry, defensive wise, it was I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, guys. Sorry, number 4 total offensive team in the league last season, or defensive team. Number 6 scoring defensive team in the league. But one of the things Montana State can do is they can absolutely suffocate, like Idaho likes to do in terms of time of possession strategy. They can absolutely suffocate teams. And if you look through Montana State's schedule last season, they had that one weird NAU week. But for the most part, Montana State is just steady and talented. And that's why, to me, they're kind of a no-brainer as the number 1 pick in the Big Sky preseason.
Yeah, Brian, I hate saying this because, the homer in me, I want to pull my inner Martin out and say Idaho's going to win this conference and punch every single other team right in the face. A little inside baseball for you as you're listening to this. For every one of the teams we've talked about, I wrote up a quick brief on it, and then bolded and underlined just a couple questions to summarize the team. And what I summarized Montana State with was, there's nothing to say here. This is the best squad in the league, and if any Big Sky team wins the national championship, it's going to be this one. If they stay healthy, they're going to go all the way. They bring back 9 starters from last year's offense, including the entire offensive line. They lost 1 letter winner across their entire offensive line depth. The 14 or so guys that are in the room, they lost 1 guy that had a letter. They bring back every single starter. They proved last year and the year before that, again, losing to SDSU in the semifinals this year. And again, they play SDSU week 2, September 9th. That's going to be probably one of the best games of the season. They lost to SDSU in the semifinals. They lost in the national championship game the year before that. This team is loaded from front to back. They have all conference guys on both sides of the ball. And Brian, you're right. This team is boring to talk about because they just go in and they punch people right in the mouth. They shove it down your throat and they just brutalize their opponents. And it's just going to keep happening where I just don't see how this could fall apart this year, where they're bringing back realistically the entire team from last year. I know they lost 4 starters on the defense, but they have so much depth there and so many guys that they've rotated in that had good numbers last year. They should be just fine. Obviously on the offense, they're going to be completely fine. They lost their best receiver, but they don't throw it that much anyways. They're okay when they do, but that's not what they're doing out there. Sean Chambers and Tommy Millott would probably be the best running backs on half the teams in the Big Sky. That's just how things work for them. I don't see anything to me on their schedule. Yes, they have a tougher schedule. They have South Dakota State. They go to Weber. They go to Sac State. They go to Idaho. They go to Montana. Yes, those all stink. Even if they lost all of those games somehow, some way, I still think they get into the playoffs. I still think that they make a run in the playoffs. This team is just too good from top to bottom. We're not at the point yet that Idaho can compete with this. I think Montana State is far and away the number 1 team in the Big Sky. As, again, the nationwide voters and the coaches agree, Montana State being 3rd behind North Dakota State and South Dakota State in both the stats poll and the coaches poll. There's really not a lot to say, Brian. This is just a really damn good football team.
No, dude, what you said about the line, what Montana State has on the offensive line is what Jason Eck's trying to build at Idaho and what he helped build at South Dakota State. But Montana State's already there. They've had time. And then defensive side of the ball, look, they have two members of their D line are all preseason All Big Sky, 2 of their linebackers preseason All Big Sky. This is just a talented, tough team. That's it. I want to circle back for a second, talk about Montana. We talk about Montana State the way Montana wants to be talked about and believes that Bobby Howe probably believes they should be talked about. But Montana State, they've arrived. And I honestly have no idea how the way Montana State plays offensively. Look, when teams are pass heavy, you can understand hey, the elements will change the flow of a game. Or you could also say, hey, a quarterback has an off day and throw some picks. Well, Montana State doesn't have that issue. This is just a steady team. You have to be very good to beat them, or have Montana just try to clusterfuck the game away. They did against Northern Arizona last year. The team's just solid. I don't know what else to say about Montana State, other than look, they've made the Final Four better the last 2 seasons because they've arrived and because Brent Vegan has a system in place. I guess the biggest question is, how many coaches at Montana State pick up DUIs this season is the real question. Is can you be an offensive or defensive coordinator at Montana State and not be on DUI probation?
I mean, maybe someday Uber will come to Bozeman. Maybe someday they will get Uber. Maybe they'll get a couple more stoplights. Maybe they'll become a whole thing. We are over an hour and a half into this podcast. I've got no final thoughts on Montana State. So I'm going to quickly read off our list here. Number 1, Montana State. Number 2, Idaho. Number 3, UC Davis. Number 4, Montana. Number 5, Sacramento State. Number 6, Weber State. Number 7, Eastern Washington. Number 8, Northern Colorado. Number 9, Coward Poly. Number 10, Northern Arizona. Number 11, top 5, Portland State. And last, number 12 in the conference, the Idaho State Mongols. Ryan, any final thoughts before we put this to bed?
No, man, I got to go. I just got to say thankful for show sponsor Snake River Stampede Canadian Whiskey, Sporting a Vandal, Sporting Tubs. Oh, yeah, actually, I do have one more thing to say. Hey, help us out at patreon.com/Tubs at the club. Join the #OnlyTubs Discord. It's going to be active as hell now that the season has started. Help support the show. And also take part in what I think is the best online Idaho discussion that you can find.
Absolutely. Our Discord will be popping off here over the next couple weeks and months as, again, we do game day threads. If you're sitting here wanting to either tell us that we're idiots or tell us that you agree with us for whatever reason, hop in, join the Patreon, message with us. Obviously, Vandal home games are a little bit different because we're usually there, but all the away games, we're sitting there messaging back and forth. It just becomes a nice little place to hang out and talk football with everybody. I do want to give one last shout out to Hughes River. For anybody that remembers the ad and the per said meteor shower, that happened earlier this week. If you are looking for a great all-inclusive week-long vacation, do not look past your backyard. It's Hughes River Expedition. They could have shown you that per said meteor shower. Don't miss it next year. Brian, go Vandals.
Go Vandals.